about history for a number of reasons. One is just that it's interesting. It's really the history, or a way into the history of civilization. Two, it gets at the nitty gritty of how printing works and how ink is put on paper, and designers have to know some of that practically, or at least print designers do. And three, we talk about history because it is vocabulary, because the styles and the approaches of the past can be used either purely or can be used as influences to create modern typographical statements. History is vocabulary just as much as knowing a technique in Illustrator or InDesign is vocabulary you can use to make your designs. Knowing about typographical history helps you come up with solutions as well, and we'll just look at a little bit of that. Now, for the last project, which is two parts really, everyone is going to make a Pinterest board, or if you're not into Pinterest, you can put it together as a PDF instead, of typographical eras. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not so much that important whether the pieces you choose actually come from the era that they are from. They could be influenced by that era, or they could be from a nearby decade, but sort of in the older style or the newer style, just to get a sense of what eras look like, or how get a sense of how design and the style of design has changed over time. So, first of all, we have to have some sort of organizational device for the Pinterest boards, and most people do use Pinterest. And decades is as logical a way to do that as anything. That doesn't mean that everything within a decade looks the same. It doesn't mean there isn't change within the decade, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it does mean, and it doesn't mean that decades have, or eras have, clear boundaries. So these two are both early 60s pieces of graphic design. But they still sort of evoke the 50s. I think this one's 61 and this one is 62, and they have a kind of a 50s feel. And if you found these and you put these on your 50s board or your 60s board, it doesn't super matter. What matters is you're getting a sense of the style of the decade. Now, very much later in the decade, design starts to look a bit more like this. Now, I should say as well that in a decade there are counter trends. There are different trends. So, and one of the drivers of trends tends to be youth, and so this is the youth movement of the late '60s. It's roughly contemporaneous with this ad. Probably about 67, 68. And this evokes the style of music that was popular at the time and the style of drug use, psychedelia, that was popular at the time. And the colors that you see here are very much a reflection of that mood. But this is also a form of design. So you may find that your 60s board, maybe it has a bunch of different things, or maybe there's some part of the 60s design or 50s design that you like, and you're focusing on that. That doesn't really matter, just so long as you're looking for work and accumulating it and getting a sense of that work. Now, speaking of the youth, eventually youth movements get co-opted. These two ads very much reflect the feel of that swirling 60s poster on the other side. That sort of lettering that we see in the bright psychedelic colors in the 7-Up ad. As mainstream movements tend to co-opt youth movements tend to lose interest in that stuff and move on. When it gets co-opted by the man, it is no longer cool, but that is also inevitable. So when I talked about design being vocabulary, this is exactly what I mean. This is a Tom Wolfe novel, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Tests, and it's about acid use, and it's set in the 60s. And talking about that stuff is, it's sort of natural for a designer to get into some of those 60s influences. But the solution to that is not always the same or always obvious. So here we have sort of two fairly literal approaches at that. Now, I think on the right we have the original cover. This is the contemporaneous cover for the book, and this is for a reprint, which is speaking of that kind of swirling approach to typography that was in that contemporaneous poster, and also these sort of acid colors. But you can grab that stuff a little bit more, a little bit less literally. Also copy versions of the same book, some more successful than others, and some of which have more of a blend of contemporary design. So this one here that I have big is, I think, kind of a disaster. It just sort of randomly selects, say, Art Deco font. Art Deco fonts were undergoing a revival in the 60s. The name is big, and up the side it pushes green and purple together, which is kind of a acid combination, I guess. But it's a fairly unattractive cover. I would say this one is very minimal in its approach. This one is probably my favorite of these, with the contemporary typeface, but treated a little bit more. A little bit like someone on acid was looking at it a little bit more with swirls in the type. And this one, I think that one's just kind of but those are all approaches that borrow from the era and use the visual vocabulary of the era to talk about a book that is from that era. So, then here we have the 70s. Early 70s, well, mid 70s for this, and this is the youth movement that eventually replaces the acid rock, which is punk, and that is a much more streamlined and minimalist aesthetic, or sort of cruder aesthetic, I should say, rather than minimalist, because some of those posters were actually not so minimal, but just kind of pared down to the basics. And this is still, even though it's a 70s movie, picking up some of those sort of 60s influences. So that is, part of it is to just do the Pinterest boards, 10 pins per board, to get a sense of what eras look like and get a sense of how design styles have changed over time. And that's basically outlined in the syllabus for where those decades are denoted. And the other part of it is going to be the final design, which is of a ad for a contemporary product, something that is new, but is designed in such a way that it could have looked like it came from whichever one of your chosen decades you want to focus on.